Welcome to this explainer. If you felt like artificial intelligence went from some weird, distant sci-fi concept to something your neighbor uses to write emails literally overnight, you are definitely not alone. But the truth is, it absolutely did not happen overnight. Today, we're going to trace this cumulative 9-year shift. We'll follow it all the way from a quiet, easily ignored research paper straight through to the massive global governance crisis we're facing right now. Let's actually kick things off with a rather cinematic thought from a recent tech piece by Aaron Rose. He points out that the AI era didn't arrive with a loud bang, right? There was no ribbon cutting, no bold front page headline declaring a new age. Nobody announced that the world had changed. Instead, it just kind of snuck up on us, hiding right in plain sight. To understand exactly how that happened, we have to rewind back to 2017, the paper nobody read. Just think back to the tech landscape of 2017. The media was breathlessly hyping up quantum computing, buzzing about subatomic particles, and these theoretical supermachines. And in all that noise, they completely missed the real revolution that was brewing quietly over a Google brain. While the whole world was looking one way, a team of researchers published this very philosophical-sounding paper called Attention is All You Need. And at the time, well, it barely made a ripple outside of some highly specialized, incredibly nerdy circles. But the fundamental shift introduced in that paper was a brand new neural network architecture called the transformer. Before this, machines processed language sequentially. Basically, they read left to right, word by word, kind of like a person sounding out syllables. And because of this, they were incredibly slow and had, frankly, terrible memory for long documents. But this new transformer architecture, it was parallel. It introduced something called self-attention, which basically allowed the machine to grasp an entire passage simultaneously. It could instantly understand the relationships between completely distant parts of a text. And this, right here, was the exact engine that literally everything else would eventually run on. So, over the next 3 years, this architecture built up incrementally inside research labs, specifically inside a capped profit company you might have heard of called OpenAI. They took that transformer architecture and started building their GPT, or Generative Pre-trained Transformer series. In 2018, we got GPT-1. By 2019, GPT-2 caused a brief stir because, actually, they initially held it back, worried about it generating misinformation. And then, right in the middle of a global pandemic in mid-2020, GPT-3 arrived. This model was so large and so capable, it was writing essays, generating code, translating languages, that researchers interacting with it began writing about it with absolute awe. But still, the general public, we really had no idea. Which brings us to 2022, the moment everything changed. Suddenly, the slow, quiet buildup burst out of the labs and right into our living rooms. On November 30th, 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT just as a research preview. They were genuinely expecting modest interest. Instead, they hit 100 million users in just 2 months. To put that completely wild number into perspective, it took TikTok 9 whole months to reach that exact same milestone. It was literally the fastest consumer product adoption in the history of technology up to that point. So why did it explode so suddenly? Well, the secret is what we call the zero barrier pivot. You see, ChatGPT didn't win because of some massive, sudden leap in the raw underlying technology. Remember, developers had already been playing with GPT-3 for 2 years. No, it won because of the interface. It dropped the barrier to entry to absolute zero. For the very first time, everyday people with zero technical training could just type a question in plain English and get a patient, highly coherent response at 3 in the morning. It was just genuinely startling to experience. And that perfectly sets the stage for 2023. The AI race begins. In response to ChatGPT, competitors didn't just blindly copy each other, they actually fragmented the market. They placed entirely different philosophical bets on what society actually wanted from artificial intelligence. OpenAI pushed forward with ChatGPT, betting entirely on raw capability and usefulness. Then you had Anthropic, founded by former OpenAI researchers, who built Claude with a massive foundational bet on safety and honesty. Meanwhile, Inflection AI released Pi, betting that people actually wanted an emotional, patient companion rather than just a really smart calculator. And the massive tech giants were moving just as fast, but with wildly different outcomes. Google, the very company whose engineers invented the transformer in the first place, found itself caught completely flat-footed. They rushed out their chatbot Bard and suffered a highly visible, incredibly costly error right in their demonstration video. But contrast that with what Microsoft did. They quietly and super effectively embedded AI into the daily workflows of hundreds of millions of office workers by just putting Copilot directly into Word, Excel, and Outlook. And Meta, they took a completely different route, releasing their Llama models open source to researchers. In an instant, the race broadened out globally. Moving into 2024, curiosity becomes global infrastructure. At this point, AI stops being just a fun little browser novelty you play with on your lunch break. It becomes hardwired global infrastructure, and a major geographic shift occurs here. Up until this point, it really felt like an American monopoly. But then DeepSeek, a Chinese AI lab, released models that matched or even exceeded the performance of the leading Western models, and they did it at a fraction of the reported training cost. This proved definitively that the AI race is fully global, and the US leading position is absolutely not guaranteed. It landed like a massive disruption inside an already massive disruption. Meanwhile, the news cycle was completely dominated by these benchmark wars, with companies constantly fighting over who had the absolute smartest model. But the real story was happening quietly in the background. API costs absolutely plummeted. That meant a single solo developer could build complex tools that would have required a whole team just 2 years prior. And major corporations were quietly integrating AI into high-stakes legal, medical, and financial operations way faster than public coverage could even track. Which lands us in 2025 and 2026. Agents, autonomy, and governance. Look, if you're still thinking about AI as just a chatbot, you are already way behind. The chatbot interface? It's basically obsolete now. We have made a massive, fundamental jump to agentic AI. We've moved completely from machines that merely answer our questions to machines that actually take actions. An agent doesn't just give you a recipe. An agent browses the web, manages files, executes code, and completes multi-step tasks over an extended period entirely on its own, without you having to guide it at every single step. Today, these agents are turning into true active workflow participants. Anthropic released Claude Code, which can actually read an entire software codebase, understand its complex architecture, and implement fixes all by itself. OpenAI released Operator, a system designed to literally take over your web browser and complete tedious tasks for you. And Google's Gemini integrated directly into the core of Android, acting as a persistent, always-on assistant. The distinction between a passive tool you use and an active participant in your workflow has completely blurred. And that brings us back to how we actually feel about all of this. As Aaron Rose beautifully metaphoricizes, we have essentially been living next to a river that was quietly rising for 9 years without us really noticing. And now, the water has finally crested its banks. The AI era didn't sneak up on the researchers who were obsessively watching the water level, but it absolutely snuck up on everyone else. Most people, most institutions, and most definitely our governments. Which leaves us with this final, very provocative reality. The story is no longer about whether the technology is capable. It is incredibly capable. In fact, the capabilities have exceeded what researchers even projected. So the only remaining questions are about how we adapt to it. Who decides what these highly autonomous systems are actually allowed to do? Under what constraints? With what oversight? And ultimately, who are they accountable to? The world has already been rewritten. Now we have to figure out how we're going to govern it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this brought some clarity to the unbelievable 9 years we've just lived through.